Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Hat Historian. In this video, I will be talking about a very common military and police hat, the side cap. The side cap, sometimes also called Garrison cap, forage cap, and a variety of other more colorful nicknames you can look up on your own, is an undress fatigue hat that was well liked, as it could be folded and stuffed into a pocket or packed without damaging it. It is made of a band of cloth with an upper vent. When it is not worn, it has a somewhat rectangular shape, a little like an envelope. Historically worn in barracks or during rest times, it became today the main hat, and even in some cases the dress hat, of some units. So let us see how it evolved. For such a simple hat, the side cap's origins are influenced by numerous nations, including France, the United Kingdom, of which Scotland in particular, Austria and Serbia. Two main paths and styles can be distinguished in its development which, while they resemble each other, evolved independently. The French model, a little simpler, and the British model, easy to recognize with its front buttons. The ancestor of the side cap began as a fatigue cap for the French army in the 18th century. At that time, when they were not wearing the large tricorns of their full uniform, soldiers had simple soft caps. Often made by the men themselves using the leg from an old pair of trousers in the regiment's colors, it had very little in common in appearance with the modern version. There were two models, the pokalem of some foot troops with a flat top, and the model of mountain troops. Long and pointed, they tended to resemble what we picture as a nightcap with a folded bottom and a long point topped with a tassel. It was fully officialized with a directive from April 25th, 1767, which gave it a standard description with a 3-inch or 8-centimeter cuff at the bottom and a fleur-de-lis in the regiment's color. The long point, called the flamme, was either worn hanging on the side or often tucked into the cuff, with the tassel sticking out in front. In 1791, new regulations spread this model called the dragoon model to all troops, not just mounted ones, though many already had similar ones, and gave it piping and tape to differentiate regiments more easily. The cuff was also made bigger so it could be turned down in cold weather. This model with the long flame remained standard, simply with color, size, and ornamentation changes, all the way until 1830. After that, the tip of the point was cut off, and the top is stitched together, making it straight and giving the hat a shape closer to what we now know, though it is still rather large. The tassel is now simply attached to a small cord on the front, a feature some armies like the Belgians kept until World War I. Between the Napoleonic Wars and the 1860s, many neighboring countries influenced by France adopted similar hats to wear in the barracks instead of the heavy shakos. In France it was abandoned for most troops in the 1870s, replaced by the képi. It was brought back by a decree on July 22, 1891 that called for a smaller archtop hat called Serbian style, inspired by the šajkača, a traditional Serbian hat developed in the 18th century by troops navigating the river of the same name, who created a hat resembling an upside-down boat. This new model was simpler, compact, and cheaper to manufacture, often with cloth salvaged from worn-out uniforms, and had no ornamentation other than the wearer's rank, though some would add unofficially a regiment number. It spread in subsequent years to become the beret's cover for the whole army, and at that point had taken on roughly its current shape. The other origin for the side cap comes from the British. Much like the French, in the 18th century, soldiers would make themselves a fatigue cap with salvaged cloth, though they often had a slightly different shape. Long distinctive for each regiment, they were regulated by the War Office in 1811. They cohabitated during parts of the 19th century with forage caps, so-called because they were worn when foraging for food, small pillbox-shaped hats that looked a bit like a bellhop's cap. These barracks covers were eventually replaced by another similar-looking hat, the Scottish Glengarry. It was long a regimental hat for the Glengarry Fencibles, a Highland regiment formed by Alexander Ranaldson MacDonald of Glengarry. He is said to have created it by taking a Balmoral bonnet and reshaping it so that it folded flat. Long unique to that group, it spread to all Highland regiments for their undress uniforms in the 1850s, when they were not wearing their tall bonnets. Then, in 1868, a version without the checkered tartan or plumes typical of Scotland was adopted by most British soldiers. This evolved into a cap called the torin, very similar to the French one, that was often made in the regiment's colors. But the forage cap of the British Army as we now know it, with its buttons on the front, appeared, for a brief time, in 1897. It was called the Austrian cap, and was inspired by the Bergmütze of the Austro-Hungarian forces. Simplified, the visor was folded back under the buttons, and remained simply as a symbolic feature, and a crease was added on the top to allow it to be folded flat, but it kept the folded ear flaps that could be unfolded to protect the ears from cold. However, this model did not last long, and was replaced by other caps during a reimagining of British uniforms in 1902, remaining simply an option for officers who might choose it. At the beginning of World War I, the side cap was therefore simply an undress cap for barracks wear, mostly used by France, countries influenced by it like Belgium, or supplied by it like Greece. But this conflict, that brought about so many changes in the uniforms and equipment of armies, would cause a great expansion of its presence in numerous armed forces. Already, before the start of the war, several early air forces introduced it for when pilots weren't wearing their flight helmets, like the Royal Flying Corps in 1912 or the Imperial Russian Air Force in 1913, the association with which gave it its name of pilotka, or pilot's cap in Russian. Then, with the adoption of combat helmets throughout the war, it was considered a practical hat as it could be simply folded into a pocket when the helmet was worn, or even sometimes worn under it during cold weather as it was soft. The US Expeditionary Forces encountered the side cap in France, where they ordered some from the French to wear instead of the large campaign hats, too wide to be easily stowed when wearing helmets, and referred to it as the overseas caps, though only troops serving alongside French units got them. France also redesigned theirs from a slightly arched shape to a squarer one, reminiscent of the imperial ones, which became very fashionable. The High Command did not object, as this new shape was easier and cheaper to manufacture. After the war, the shape of the side cap was more or less firmly established, but it still had some ways to go before being firmly entrenched. The US set it aside shortly after the armistice, though it was enthusiastically adopted by the new Soviet Union. Originally reserved for military cadets, eventually it got issued to all troops, men and women, replacing the impractical Budenovka, and became a symbol of the Red Army, with its red star on the front. But it is especially in the 30s that it became fashionable for many armies who were modernizing their equipment and uniforms in the ramp-up towards World War II, which many felt was coming. Germany replaced its old round cap, which resembled a sailor cap, with a side cap during its 1935 reforms, which they called the Schiffchen, or little boat, and which sort of resembled a cross between the French and British concepts, with its ear flaps but without the buttons. Italy adopted a model they called the Bustina, with a strap going over the top, as the standard headdress for their troops. The British reintroduced its model, until then reserved for airmen, in 1937 when they adopted the new battle dress. The United States, who had abandoned it in 1918, had reintroduced a form of it in 1933 for tank drivers and for the new Army Air Corps, as it could be worn with earphones. It developed a model in 1939 that was finalized in 1943. Originally featuring regimental piping, this was quickly abandoned for enlisted men who would otherwise be forced to acquire a new one if they were reassigned, and to make supply easier by having a single universal model. Officers had a silver or gold piping. Famously, airborne troops had their insignia sewn on it, to the left for enlisted and to the right for officers, while for everybody else it simply carried rank insignia in the army. Marines and Navy also had their own versions, with the Navy or Eagle, Globe and Anchor insignia on them. Many other armies in the conflict had some form or another to wear an in-combat uniform, but outside active fighting. While the side cap experienced its zenith in the years during and after World War II, the British had already started introducing its main successor in some of their grand troops, the beret. While it took more time elsewhere, in the 60s, as I mentioned in the video on the subject, the beret became increasingly popular, replacing the side cap in many land forces. In the US, this happened in the wake of Vietnam in the US Army, though the Marines kept their traditional garrison cap, and France, who originated the beret as military wear with the chasseur alpin, to this group's displeasure, spread it army-wide. But this change for most forces only applies to their land component. The side cap remained the main undress cover for many Air Force aviators, often in a blue version as I mentioned above, it can easily be folded into a flight suit pocket when the helmet is worn, and taken out when needed. The Soviets and their allies, very attached to their pilotka, kept it until the dissolution of the USSR, and the Russian forces only recently started replacing it with berets. While it suffered a loss in popularity in the 60s and 70s, the side cap is still worn to this day in many fields, and is even experiencing a resurgence in some cases. As I just said, it never vanished from most air forces, and in some cases even became the service dress hat, not just the fatigue one, such as in the Royal Canadian Air Force, who issue the British version with the buttons and ear flaps. This style is also worn, when dress caps are not required, by the British themselves naturally, but also some of their former colonies like Indians or Kenyans. The simpler French model, of course, also stayed standard in the French Air Force, but also the US Air Force, the Germans, the Portuguese, and many other countries inspired by them in Africa and South America. It also exists in some navies, in the United States or Russia notably, and a very peculiar version is worn by Brazilian Marines. While set aside by land forces for many years, some are reintroducing it. France has been bringing it back as a common cover in units with traditional attachment to it, and it has been brought back as the standard cover for enlisted wearing the US Army's green service uniform, which was inspired by World War II styles. The Marines, it should be noted, had kept it the whole time. In many cases, it is also used by military cadets and students in military programs. American veterans can also often be seen wearing one with the name of their conflict they served in. Beyond its use as a fatigue hat, some more decorated versions, sometimes stiffened, have become the dress hat of certain units. I've already mentioned the Canadian Air Force, but it is also the case for the Queen's Royal Hussars, who wear their distinctive tent hat. The Danish Armed Forces also wear a stiffened version as their service dress hat. A version with a tassel on the front, recalling the long point of the 18th century versions, is worn by the men of the Spanish Legion, which also features a small chin strap, and Norwegian Guards also wear a decorated and tasseled version, which they called the Gardelue. Finally, the Glengarry is still worn by British Army Scottish regiments. Besides armed forces, it is also part of the uniform of many police forces, which are inspired by military styles. After trying a soft cap that proved very unpopular, the French Gendarmerie adopted a side cap as its standard field hat, after offering it as an option, and seeing the officers' strong preference for it. The Swedish wear the Batmosa, or boat hat, as their standard headdress, and the National Guard of Portugal have a version they called bivake. A version with a chin strap is worn by Finnish border guards, and one based on the British model is common in Indian police departments and many, many others. In civilian circles, the side caps exist in certain forms. Many Serbians still wear the sashkacha for formal events and ceremonies, though it is less worn by young people in day-to-day life. In Nepal, a traditional hat known as the topi follows the same shape as the side cap, though they are not directly related as far as I know. In some higher education schools in France, students wear the kalo, versions highly decorated with pins in the manner of student caps, a nod to their historic associations with military preparation. Scout groups in certain countries wear them, and they're also part of the uniform of some flight attendants, such as for Aeroflot. Finally, a paper version is traditionally associated with ice cream shop vendors in the US. From a simple hat made for barracks wear by the soldiers themselves, the side cap, through its simplicity and ease of carry, has become a military headdress recognized throughout the world, and in some cases has become a dress attribute. Revived in some places, it seems to still have long years ahead of it. So I hope once again you found this video interesting and will join me again soon for another hat. Until then, I tip my hat to you.